A leader stands at the base of a trembling, smoking mountain. The desert air smells heavily of ozone, dust, and slaughtered oxen. Most people assume the Book of the Covenant, the Torah. The Law of Moses is just an ancient legal code. When he walks into the suffocating, pitch-black darkness of the Holy of Holies, the smell of burning frankincense fills the small room. The warm blood of the goat hits the gold of the mercy seat. And right there, resting against the side of the throne, is the written contract. It is a witness to what they promised, a witness to the blood they splashed on their faces at Sinai. The physical presence of the scroll by the ark guarantees that God will never forget the terms of his marriage. It holds the King of the universe to his own vows, but a witness is only effective if someone remembers to look at it. The canvas tabernacle gives way to a massive temple of stone. Centuries pass. Kings rise and fall. Armies march across the terraced hills of Judah. The priests grow wealthy. The altars are repurposed for foreign gods. The sacrifices become a hollow, mechanical routine, and the scroll is lost. It is not burned. It is not stolen by invading empires. It is simply misplaced in the cluttered, dusty storerooms of a corrupted religious system. A nation completely forgets the terms of its own existence. The darkness settles over Jerusalem for nearly 300 years, until a young boy inherits a broken throne, and the sound of a stonemason's hammer hits a hidden wall. If you grew up around the church, you probably picture it as a massive, intimidating list of arbitrary things you can and cannot do. History reveals a terrifying reality about human institutions. You do not lose the foundational document of your existence by sudden theft. You lose it by a slow, creeping process of administrative displacement. For over half a century under the vicious reign of Manasseh, the temple in Jerusalem was not abandoned. It was heavily trafficked. It was filled with active priests, burning incense, and daily sacrifices. But those altars were built for the host of heaven. The religion kept moving. The ceremonies remained beautifully choreographed. The machinery of worship hummed along perfectly, while the actual covenant lay buried under decades of debris in a dark, forgotten storeroom. We are watching the anatomy of institutional amnesia. When a people remove the text from the center of their identity, they do not stop worshiping. They simply begin worshiping the architecture of their own culture. Then comes the year 622 BC, and a theological earthquake hits the capital. The young king Josiah orders a structural renovation of the decaying temple complex. Carpenters are hauling heavy cedar timber. Scribes are weighing out pieces of silver on bronze scales to pay the stonemasons, and in the middle of the thick dust and the rubble, the high priest, Hilkiah, unearths a heavy, ancient parchment, the Sefer HaBeret, the Book of the Covenant. The document is carried across the city to the palace. We naturally read these texts through the lens of our modern judicial systems. We think of cold stone courthouses, blindfolded justice, and sterile court transcripts. A scribe named Shaphan unrolls the stiff leather. He reads the ancient stipulations, the blessings, and the horrific curses of the suzerain treaty out loud. In the royal court, Josiah does not politely nod at his religious heritage. He grabs the collar of his royal tunic and violently tears the fabric in half. He weeps openly in front of his officials. If you understand the mechanics of the ancient Near Eastern treaty, his absolute panic makes perfect sense. For decades, the nation has been aggressively violating every single stipulation of the blood-sworn contract. They have triggered the ancient curses. They have broken the marriage vows, and the legal consequences are catastrophic. Josiah is not reading a piece of theological history. He is reading a warrant for his nation's execution. The scroll was designed to be a witness, and it is now bearing witness against them. The words on the page demand a judgment that no amount of silver or temple renovation can buy off. The king realizes that the God of the covenant is bound by his own holiness to act. Josiah's desperate reforms attempt to pull the nation back from the brink. He crushes the false idols. He restores the Passover. The temple was purged, and the scroll was honored. But the judgment was already set in motion. A generation later, the Babylonian war machine breaches the walls. The city is gutted. The temple is burned to bedrock. We imagine a distant, unpleasable deity handing down an impossible standard just to prove a point about human failure, and the people are dragged away into a 70-year exile. Yet the scroll survives the fire, and when a traumatized remnant finally returns to a ruined city, the document is brought out into the light one more time. Autumn sunlight beats down on the ruined streets of Jerusalem. The defensive walls are finally rebuilt, but the burn marks remain on the stones. A massive wooden platform stands in the open square before the Watergate. The people gather. Men, women, anyone old enough to understand. They stand shoulder to shoulder in the crushed limestone and dust. Ezra, the scribe, climbs the wooden steps. He carries the scroll. The moment his hands unroll the heavy leather parchment, a profound silence falls over the square. Thousands of people stand up. Nobody tells them to rise. The physical movement is an involuntary reaction to the sheer gravity of what is happening. Ezra begins to read aloud. He reads from the first pale light of dawn until the midday sun burns directly overhead. Nehemiah chapter 8. Verse 3 says, "And the ears of all the people were attentive to the book of the law." The English translation gives us the word attentive. The Hebrew text uses the word shama. It does not just mean the physical reception of acoustic sound waves. We treat the law as a dry, exhausting manual of religious compliance. The Book of the Covenant is not a rule book. Shama means to listen with the whole body. It means to hear with the explicit intent to obey, to internalize, to let the words actively alter your posture. It is the root behind the most famous daily prayer of Israel, Shema Yisrael. Hear, O Israel. As the stipulations and the stories wash over the crowd, a sound begins to rise from the square. It starts as a low murmur. It builds into a collective, chest-heaving wail. Thousands of grown men and women drop into the dirt. They press their faces against the earth. They weep uncontrollably. This is not the weeping of terrified vassals facing a tyrant. It is the weeping of a bride who has suddenly recognized her husband's voice. For 70 years in Babylon, they lived without the temple. They lived without the sacrificial altars. They lived as a scattered, broken remnant surrounded by the massive, silent statues of foreign gods. But standing at the Watergate, hearing the Sefer Habarit read aloud, they realized what they had actually lost. They had lost the terms of their own marriage. The scroll is not a rigid list of ancient restrictions they are afraid of breaking. It is the definitive proof that they still belong to someone. The tears falling into the dirt are the tears of sheer, overwhelming relief. It is a marriage certificate written in blood. If you miss what is actually happening in these rare, ceremonial moments, the document survives the fire of exile. It anchors a broken people in the dust of their ruined city. But when you step out of the ancient world and into the modern era, something tragic happens to this exact same text. Something that strips away the blood, the marriage vows, and the weeping, and leaves us holding a completely different kind of document. We do not read scrolls. We read screens. We do not smell the roasted meat of the brazen altar. We do not feel the warm blood hitting our faces in the desert wind. We sit under the low hum of fluorescent lights. We flip through pages as thin as onion skin. We parse the grammar. We extract the theological data. We strip the ancient text of its visceral, terrifying, relational weight. We take a marriage certificate written in blood, and we turn it into an HR manual. This is the modern tragedy of the Old Testament. We approach the Book of the Covenant through the sterile, detached lens of Western jurisprudence. We compile lists. We debate the rules. We argue over the cultural boundaries. We reduce the creator of the cosmos to a divine hall monitor with a clipboard. We treat the text like a standardized test we are destined to fail. We read Leviticus, and we see a dictator. When the physical scroll is brought out from the shadows, you will fundamentally misunderstand the God of the Old Testament. We read Deuteronomy, and we see a burden. We read Exodus, and we see a list of impossible demands. We ask questions the text was never meant to answer. We obsess over the dietary restrictions. We mock the agricultural laws. We treat these ancient stipulations like arbitrary hurdles God set up just to watch a fractured humanity trip over them. When modern believers divorce the law from the covenant, we create a phantom rulebook. We create a set of disconnected moral chores floating in a vacuum. We create a burden with no bridegroom. The Book of the Covenant is not a behavioral checklist. It is a blueprint for proximity. Every rule about ceremonial washing, every regulation about camp boundaries, every strange statute regarding mildew and woven fabrics was designed to answer one impossible question. How does a God made of pure, consuming fire pitch his tent in the middle of a neighborhood made of dry brush? How does he move into the center of the camp without his sheer holiness burning the people to the ground? The law was the insulation. It was the protective perimeter. It was the specific grace that allowed God to stay. We look at the ancient law and we see a cage. The Israelites looked at the law and saw a tether. They saw the explicit, physical proof that they had not been abandoned to the silence of the desert. You will see a dictator demanding submission, rather than a groom binding himself to a fractured, wandering bride. The boundaries meant the king was still in residence. The stipulations meant the husband had not filed for divorce. But the problem with a tether is that human hands are weak. The problem with a suzerain treaty is that it demands absolute, unwavering fidelity. The curses wait patiently in the ink. And what happens when the bride shatters the terms of the marriage entirely? A prophet throws warm blood onto a terrified crowd, and a marriage is sealed in the desert. A scribe presses a stylus into wet Mesopotamian clay, and a tyrant's template becomes a husband's vow. A dying leader places a scroll beside a golden box, and a sovereign king binds himself to his own accountability. A young monarch tears his royal robes in a dusty storeroom, and a wandering nation remembers a forgotten judgment. A priest reads aloud from a wooden platform in the autumn sun, and a scattered people weep at the sound of a familiar voice. A holy God dictates the impossible terms of proximity, and dry brush survives the presence of consuming fire. A covenant is written in the blood of bulls and goats, and the stage is set. You will see restriction. When the text is desperately trying to show you relationship, the real question these dramatic scenes ask of us is not for a document that will be signed in the blood of a son. Same scroll, same God. But maybe the part that stays with me most is the blood on the woven tunics, not the blood on the stone altar. The blood that Moses threw directly onto the bodies of the people themselves. It means this covenant was never meant to be kept at a safe, sterile distance. It was always meant to touch the skin. If you are in a season where God feels more like an angry hall monitor than a faithful husband, if you are exhausted from carrying a phantom rulebook and constantly terrified of failing the test, you have to look past the stipulations. The law is not a cage designed to hold you. It is the proof that he has pitched his tent in the center of your brokenness. If this reached something in you, subscribe. Leave a comment, even one word helps. Share this with someone who is exhausted by the weight of a religious rulebook. Pray for us as we keep digging into these texts. How well did they follow the rules? It is this. What kind of king hands over the terms of his own accountability? And may the God who stepped into the dirt walk with you through your wilderness and hold you when you cannot hold the line. In one hand, he holds a bronze basin sloshing with dark, warm blood. In the other, he grips a freshly written scroll. To feel the true weight of that question, you have to leave your modern assumptions behind entirely. You have to step out of the 21st century and walk into the searing heat of the ancient Near East, into a brutal world dominated by absolute monarchs, where a very specific, very dangerous kind of treaty governed human survival. The ancient world did not operate on trust. It operated on terror. If you lived in the late Bronze Age, surrounded by the empires of the Hittites or the Assyrians, survival meant knowing your absolute place. When a massive superpower swept into your territory, their iron chariots kicking up clouds of choking dust across the horizon, they did not negotiate. They offered a suzerain vassal treaty. This was a very specific, merciless legal mechanism. The Great Emperor. the suzerain, would force the lesser, defeated king, the vassal, into a binding contract of subjugation, and these documents always followed the exact same, rigid structure. A scribe would take a sharp-reed stylus and press it firmly into a tablet of wet clay. First came the preamble, where the great king declared his terrifying titles. Then the historical prologue, reminding the conquered people of the emperor's military dominance. Then came the stipulations, the suffocating tribute, the grain, the forced labor required to keep the empire happy. Finally, the scribe carved the curses. Hundreds of years later, a young king stands in the dimly lit, debris-filled storeroom of a neglected temple. This was a vivid, gruesome list of the horrific things that would happen to the vassal's body, his city, and his children if he ever failed to pay. The suzerain treaty was not a partnership. It was a leash. These clay tablets would be baked hard in the brutal Mesopotamian sun, carried back to the vassal's city, and placed at the feet of their local idol as a perpetual, silent threat. This is the political and diplomatic reality of the ancient Near East. But when modern archaeologists and linguists began unearthing these Hittite treaties, they noticed a pattern that sent shockwaves through biblical scholarship. The Book of the Covenant, the law given to Moses, follows this exact imperial blueprint perfectly. It has the preamble. It has the historical prologue. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. It has the stipulations, the witnesses, the blessings, and the curses. God is speaking to a nation of former slaves in the only political language they know how to understand. But there is a detail hiding in plain sight that shatters the entire paradigm. In the ancient world, deities did not make treaties with peasants. The gods of Egypt and Babylon were merely invoked as distant, apathetic witnesses to the treaties of violent men. The gods demanded food and fear, but they never bound themselves to a legal document. They never signed their names to a contract. A priest reads aloud to him from a faded parchment pulled from the rubble. The words hit the king with such physical force. They never promised to protect the vulnerable, the immigrant, the orphan, or the widow. Yahweh steps into the template of a tyrant, but he fills it with the terms of a faithful husband. The structure is imperial, but the substance is intimately relational. He is establishing a household, not a prison camp. But the detail that changes how you read the rest of the Old Testament is not just the structure of the ancient words. It is the shocking, visceral ritual that happens at the base of the mountain the moment the document is finished. Morning breaks over the Sinai desert. The fire burns on the peak. Thick black smoke blocks the sun. The ground vibrates under their feet. Moses stands in the center of the camp. He builds an altar of stone. He sets up 12 heavy pillars in the dirt. 12 stones for 12 tribes. Young men step forward. They bring massive bulls for the peace offerings. The iron knives flash in the early light. The heavy beasts fall. The metallic scent of warm blood mixes with the dust. Moses takes half the blood. He pours it into wide bronze basins. The other half he throws directly against the stone altar. It splashes hard against the rock. It runs down into the sand. Then, he reaches for the parchment. He holds the physical document in his hands. He unrolls it before the silent crowd. He reads every single word aloud. That he grips the collar of his royal tunic and rips the fabric straight down the middle. The people listen to the stipulations. They hear the boundaries of this new household. A unified shout echoes against the canyon walls. All that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient. What happens next defies every modern legal category. Moses picks up the heavy bronze basins. He dips a branch of hyssop into the dark red liquid. He turns away from the altar. He faces the crowd. He throws the blood on the people. It hits their faces. It stains their woven tunics. It burns warm against their skin. The writer of Hebrews tells us he even took the blood and sprinkled it across the physical scroll itself. The very words are painted in the life force of the sacrifice. This is not a courtroom proceeding. It is a covenant ritual. In the ancient mind, blood does not represent death. Blood represents life. When two parties walk between the severed pieces of an animal, or when they are covered in the same blood, they are merging their existences. They are making a vow unto death. The blood on the altar represents Yahweh. The blood on the garments represents Israel. The blood on the scroll binds them together forever. The parchment is not a sterile list of demands. It is a living, bleeding vow. God is tethering his own reputation to this broken, stiff-necked people. Generations after that, a scribe stands on a towering wooden platform above the ruined walls of a broken Jerusalem. The autumn sun beats down on his shoulders. He is writing his name on their fate. The document stands as the physical, tangible witness to the marriage. It is the artifact of their union. But to understand exactly what kind of union this is, you have to look closely at the specific name Moses gives this document, because the Hebrew phrase he uses right here in Exodus 24 changes the trajectory of the entire biblical narrative. Exodus chapter 24, verse 7. Moses stands before a crowd, still wiping the warm blood from their faces. The desert air smells heavily of copper and roasted meat. He takes the heavy animal skin parchment in his hands. English translations tell us he read from the Book of the Covenant. The Hebrew phrase recorded in the text is the Sefer HaBarit. The word sefer is almost universally translated as book in English. But the ancient world possessed no bound paper volumes. A sefer is a scroll, a written dispatch, a formal legal instrument of declaration. It comes from the root sephar, meaning to tally, to record, or to recount with absolute precision. It is an artifact of remembrance, a physical anchor designed for a people chronically prone to amnesia. And Barit is the ancient word for covenant. He unrolls a massive document, reading the text aloud from first light until midday. Below him, thousands of grown men and women collapse into the dirt, a term so old and heavy that linguists trace its origins to a root meaning to cut, or an ancient Akkadian word meaning fetter or binding. In biblical Hebrew, you do not simply make a beret. The verb perpetually paired with it is karat, to cut. You see this exact imagery in Genesis 15. When Abraham cuts animals in half and the presence of God passes between the bloody pieces in the dark, the message of a beret is visceral. May what happened to these animals happen to me if I fail, to keep my end of this promise. A beret is a bond established by a death and maintained by a vow. If feeling the relational weight behind these ancient words is shifting how you read the Old Testament, you're exactly who this channel is for. Drop a thought in the comments and hit subscribe, because every week we go deeper into the text than you knew was possible. The Sefer HaBarit is the physical ledger of the cut bond. When Moses reads this document out loud, he is not presenting, their faces pressed against the earth, weeping uncontrollably in the open square. Same object, same terrifying, gravitational pull, a religious curriculum. He is reading the marriage vows, every law, every statute, every obscure regulation about oxen, and property and infectious skin diseases is a specific boundary designed to keep the camp holy. They are requirements for proximity. Yahweh is a consuming fire, and Israel is dry brush. The law is not a hurdle they must jump over to earn God's affection. It is the protective insulation allowing a holy God to come down and pitch his tent in the middle of a broken neighborhood without his sheer presence destroying them. The Sefer HaBarit is not a mechanism of control. It is the instrument of intimacy. It proves that the creator of the cosmos did not stay safely in the heavens. He signed his name to the dirt. He gave his people a written, objective standard by which they could measure his faithfulness to them. But the true nature of this scroll is not just revealed in how it was named. It is revealed in where they put it. 40 years vanish into the sand. The wanderers stand at the edge of the river. The great prophet is dying. The hot wind blows off the plains of Moab, carrying the smell of crushed sage and ancient dust. Moses sits in his tent, across the entire span of biblical history. Whenever this specific physical document makes an appearance, the world seems to hold its breath. He holds the reed pen. He writes the final words of the law. The ink dries on the thick animal skin. He rolls the heavy parchment one last time. He calls the Levites forward. These are the men who carry the holy things. They stand before him. Their woven linen garments stained with the soot of the brazen altar. Moses hands them the heavy scroll. He gives them a command that sounds completely strange to modern ears. He tells them to take this book of the law and put it by the side of the Ark of the Covenant, that it may stand as a witness. Look closely at the geography of this command. They do not put the scroll inside the golden chest. Inside the ark rest the stone tablets, a jar of wilderness, manna, and Aaron's dead staff that miraculously bloomed with almond flowers. Those are the untouchable relics. The scroll is different. The scroll is placed on the outside. It rests directly beside the heavy wooden box. It sits beneath the shadow of the hammered gold cherubim. The Book of the Covenant is not a passive artifact. It is an active sentinel. It stays in the immediate presence of Yahweh, positioned exactly where the high priest will see it.